Hi, this is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you my wrap-up for the month of September. Now these are only 4 books, but these are the 4 books that I read in September that were not for either of the 2 readathons I participated in during the month. I did separate wrap-ups for each of those. The first of those was the Underhyped Reads readathon, and the second was the Diversathon. And I will link both of those wrap-ups for you so that if you want to know what else I read in the month of September and you missed those videos, you can find them. Okay, so this is actually a pretty exciting group of books to talk about here because 3 of them were 4-star books for me, and only one of them was a 3-star book, and that was still something I enjoyed. So, here we go. The first book I read, and this feels like it was a while ago now, so I'm trying to recall exactly what I thought of it at the time, but this was A Natural History of Dragons by Brennan. I did really enjoy this. This is the first book in the Memoir by Lady Trent series. It takes place in a secondary fantasy world, but it resembles Victorian times, and the protagonist is from a country that resembles Victorian England. So the premise of these series is that Isabella, Lady Trent, we don't actually know in this book how she's going to acquire the title of Lady Trent. That must happen later in the series. But anyways, she is narrating the story of her life for us. We know that she is the world's preeminent dragon naturalist, and that she has had a scandalous, exciting life, bursting through gender barriers and becoming a scientist at a time when that was challenging for ladies. This starts out relating her youth, her budding enthusiasm for all things dragon as a child, and how that was quelched as she got a little older. We see how she manages to catch herself a husband and eventually get herself on this dragon research trip to the country of Vistrana. Most of this book, however, focuses on that trip to Vistrana to study the rockworms, and that actually turned into much more of a mystery story than I was expecting from this book. They're staying in this rural village. Their host is mysteriously missing. They try to conduct their research without him, but they face some superstitions from the locals and also inexplicable dragon attacks. I read this book when I did, in part because it was a current read at the time for a Goodreads group that I'm a member of called Into the Forest. It's a Goodreads group that reads fairy tale and fantasy folklore stories, and the theme for a couple months was dragons, and this was one of the picks. And I enjoyed taking part in the Goodreads discussion for this book. One of the things that was very prominent in the discussion that happened over there on this book was the topic of Isabella's biases against the natives of Vistrana, and that's something I thought I'd touch on here because it hasn't been the focus of the discussions I've seen about this book on BookTube. I thought it was fairly realistic. You wouldn't expect a young Victorian or Victorian-esque in a fantasy world lady spending a considerable amount of time in a peasant village of a foreign country to have any sort of mature insight about the local culture. I actually really enjoyed the way in which the older Lady Trent narrating the story was able to comment on some of that, and we see Isabella grow in how she sees the locals throughout the course of the book. I am interested to see how Brennan chooses to develop this theme over the course of the series. I know that some of the later books take place in portions of the world, this fantasy world, that are even more far-flung, that resemble real-world places like maybe Africa, as maybe the next book does. Another thing I enjoyed about this book is, even though I'm no scientist myself, the fictional dragon science feels compelling to me. It feels plausible, and I enjoyed that. There are some illustrations in this book. I really liked the illustrations. They're not all of the dragons, but a few of them are, and for the most part, I found that the illustrations were actually very good visual representations of what was described in the text in terms of, like, dragon anatomy. So it was cool to be able to actually sort of use the illustrations as a visual reference. For the most part, this book came across to me as fairly light and fluffy fare. There was a point towards the end that sort of walloped me emotionally unexpectedly because I wasn't expecting it, but for the most part, this is lighter reading. I enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to continuing with the series. The next book I have was one that I picked up for the Underhyped Reads readathon but did not finish during that month. This is Mortal Fire by Elizabeth Knox. I mentioned in my wrap-up for that readathon that I thought this would be a very quick readathon book because it's YA and it doesn't look that big, but it's actually over 400 pages on very thin paper, so this took me a good deal longer to read than I thought it was going to. This is a young adult fantasy novel. It takes place in an alternate New Zealand in this book called Southland in 1959, and on the surface the plot of this looks fairly standard for young adult fantasy. It's about a girl who ends up on a road trip with her stepbrother and his girlfriend, and they end up in this valley where she notices all these magical things and magical people and gets involved in all of this magical stuff. But in reality, I found there were a whole lot of things that were really subtly odd about it in really fascinating ways. As I was reading this, I noticed some really basic similarities to Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, which I read a while ago and didn't like. I feel like this is kind of the book that I was hoping Miss Peregrine's would be that it wasn't. I went into that book looking for a story that was in some way fundamentally odd, and instead I just got a really fairly typical young adult fantasy. This sort of felt really unnervingly peculiar to me in a way that wasn't on the surface. The fantasy elements in this aren't really flashy or showy, but the whole book still manages to feel sort of precariously unsettling. The protagonist of this book is a teenage girl named Canny. She is a math genius and she's the daughter of an indigenous islander woman in this book called Shackle Islander. Her mother is known as a war hero for having rescued 2 soldiers during World War II by rowing them in a boat all the way to mainland Southland, and she has no idea who her father is. Canny is a nickname short for 2 different names. At school she is Agnes, with her mother she is Akanasi. She has really only one close friend who is in the hospital with polio, and Canny can also see magic in things as this written language, and she can sort of tell what it means even though she can't read it. Throughout the book we start to see an accumulation of references to how various people say that Canny is not socially competent or somehow abnormal, but we're sort of in her head the whole time, and from her point of view her behaviors are pretty normal, but sometimes I'd sort of stop myself and think, wow, that was an odd thing she just did. There is a very prominent romance in this book. It feels like a slightly odd romance to me. So I really enjoyed this, and I don't know if I'm talking about it particularly coherently. This does take place in the same world as Elizabeth Knox's Dream Hunter duet, Dream Hunter and Dreamquake, several decades later. It is a standalone. When I was in high school, I picked up Dreamquake, the second book, not knowing it was a sequel, and I was very perplexed and confused. But having a little bit of vague memory of what happened in that book, in the back of my memory, there were some references in this that struck me as vaguely familiar from that, but I don't think the plot is directly related, and you can definitely read this as a standalone. So yes, this was another one of my 4-star books. The next book I read was Precious Bane by Marillier Webb. This was written in the 20s, I think, and it is a historical fiction novel that takes place in the early 19th century in Shropshire. Shropshire is where Marillier Webb, the author, was from, and I think one of the prominent themes of this book is the love of that particular region of England, which I know nothing about. I have never been to Shropshire. It is written in first person, and it is written in a bit of a dialect, and I don't know what that regional dialect sounds like. So I had a little bit of a hard time hearing like the voice of this novel in my head because I just didn't know what sound to put on that text. I don't know if that's a problem that other people have reading books in dialects that they don't know, but it was an odd challenge for me to face. This is a combination of family drama and romance in what's a pretty bleak social setting. The protagonist of the book is a young woman named Prue who was born with a hair lip, and there's a lot of superstition surrounding being born with a hair lip at this time, and it makes her something of an outcast. I thought it was interesting though how Prue really talks about how she doesn't see it as a problem with herself until she gets to a certain point in her life where she starts noticing that other people start noticing it. Towards the beginning of this book, Prue's father dies, her older brother inherits the farm, and her brother is this really ambitious, driven character who is sort of blind to the wants and needs of the women in his family who are completely under his control. Prue clearly loves her brother and talks about him sympathetically as a narrator in this book, but it's very clear that he has this strong tragic flaw. This is also a romance novel. Prue falls in love with this young weaver named Kester, like at first sight falls in love. It's an interesting romance plot. He's clearly like a perfect human being, so I have no complaints about Kester. It's oddly structured though. They don't actually have like an actual conversation until about 2/3 of the way through the book. Until that point, there are several very dramatic things that happen between these two characters that happen without them actually like exchanging words with each other verbally in person. I found it a little difficult to take that totally seriously. So for me, this book sort of has three separate, very present things going on. There's the romance, there's the family drama, and then there's also just a lot of really gorgeous, slow, thoughtful description of life in the countryside. Prue's defining character trait, I think, is that she's very appreciative of the world around her. And I enjoyed this story, but to me, the three things that were going on here didn't really totally meld into a whole that like really worked for me. I thought the ending felt incredibly abrupt. But I did enjoy this. I gave it 3 stars, but I enjoyed it with some reservations. The last book I finished in September was Son of the Shadows by Juliet Marillier. This is the second book in her Seven Waters series. There's, it's a series that started out originally as a trilogy and then got expanded. So this is the middle book in the original trilogy. I read the first book, Daughter of the Forest, over a year ago, so I was way overdue to continue on with this series. I thought the first book actually worked fairly well as a standalone. This one is a fairy tale retelling of the Wild Swans story. I don't believe the rest of the books are direct retellings of any sort, but they do focus heavily on fae lore and mythology. This is a historical fantasy series that takes place in medieval Ireland and Britain. I am not 100% sure exactly what the century or time period is, but the whole series follows the family of the household of Seven Waters. This book, the second in the series, follows the next generation after the characters in the first book. The protagonist of this is a young woman named Readathons, who is a daughter of the House of Seven Waters. And I think this book did a really great job for me of taking a story that did work very well on its own, even though there were some things hinted that were coming in that story, and turned it into this multi-generational family saga. I don't remember a lot of details of the first book with extreme clarity because it was a while since I read it, but it felt to me like this was more focused on the overarching themes of the relationships between humans and the fae, and it had more echoes of like great destinies and meddling with fate and that sort of thing. I have started to notice, because I've read like maybe 6 books now by Juliet Marillier, I've started to see some things that keep cropping up repeatedly in her books that I start to recognize, like, oh yes, I see, you're doing this again, or you're doing this again, even though they come up in different ways. I think I have yet to find a Juliet Marillier book that I absolutely adored and gave 5 stars to, but I think she's a very reliable writer for me. I felt like this book was a little more focused on the romance than the first book. I know there was a very strong romance in the first book, but for me it wasn't the main focus of the story. Maybe that's just how I was reading it, whereas the romance felt way more central to this book. I'm not sure whether that felt like a good thing or not to me. Anyhow, I did really enjoy this one. I gave this one 4 stars, and I am looking forward to reading the 3rd book, Child of the Prophecy, sometime in upcoming months. Okie dokie, these were my 4 books that I had to cover in this wrap-up. If you've read any of them and want to chat with me about them, please leave a comment. If you have any questions about any of them that you think I might be able to answer, feel free to ask. Anyhow, that is all for today. Bye for now.